Buju Indinaway Magadag, An Indigenous, Asabagoni Zagagan and Dunjaba, Imanishiska and Dundazis, Withrow and Da. Hello, my relatives. My name is Anne. I come from the Boys Fort Band at Chippewa, Nut Lake, where my mom and grandma are enrolled. However, I was born and raised here on Dakota homelands, Imanishiska, St. Paul, and I currently live in Withrow with my sons Jacopo and Atreyu, who are there. In this picture is 3 generations of my family. So my mom, my grandma, my sister, and myself. And I just want to really center Indigenous women in this presentation and families. And I want to also acknowledge that the university, as Jalen said, is not currently a place where Indigenous students thrive. We are at a critical juncture with many wicked problems, as Dean Bochwe would say, facing us. So how can we make long-term systemic changes with the next 7 generations in mind? So a lot of institutions make 5-year plans, 10-year plans. I'm talking like 175-year plan. Like, what are you going to do to make sure that there's redress happening for as many generations as have had violence inflicted on them by the university? So I'm honored to share this space with you all today. I'm going to talk about my time in the archives and share some of my research with you. As Misty said, that focuses on the Regents' role in the dispossession and genocide of Indigenous people. And if you all have questions as we go, please ask. I'd much rather have a conversation than just sit here and lecture at you all. Yeah, next one. Okay, so I just want to situate the space that we're in. This map was created by a Dakota artist, Marlena Miles, and it locates the spaces that we know in the Twin Cities through the original people's lens. The University of Minnesota Twin Cities sits in the urbanization of what was once a lush river valley, approximately midway between 2 places central to Dakota cosmology, Owamni, colonially known as St. Anthony Falls, and Bedote, the place of Dakota creation. Dr. Jim Rock explains that what is now known as the Mississippi River is called Hahawakpa or Wakpatonka in Dakota language. It is the spirit road and it is the earthly manifestation of the Milky Way. It is also where this world and the spirit world intersect. To build upon that, Dakota author and educator Ramona Kiddo Stately wrote Pazahayayuwin, the story of Bedote. Through this story, we learn that Bedote, the confluence of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers, was a place that Dakota women traveled to give birth. The water, herbs, and plants found near the islands here aid in birthing and healing processes, and with the help of these medicines, they brought their children into the world at their place of genesis, Bedote. And so just acknowledging that traditionally the university says that it sits on ceded territory. I do want to state that by 1858, the United States had made 12 treaties with the Dakota people, often through coercive and violent means, seizing more and more land with each negotiation. And all of these treaties were eventually broken by the United States. Other U of M campuses are situated on lands taken through coercive treaties with Anishinaabe peoples. The Anishinaabe people trace our roots to the East Coast near the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. The many bands of Anishinaabe began to move westward due to a prophecy telling them to travel until they came upon lands where food grew on water. The migration inland took place over many centuries and encompassed several stops along the way. These stops required bands to separate, reconnect, and in the process, settle in various areas such as modern-day Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. I say all of this as a reminder that we had thriving communities before European settlement, and because it shows that it was an intentional act of genocide on part of the early regents to situate the university at this space. Next slide, please. So you've heard this many times, so I'll just go through it really quickly here, in order to situate this research, I'll first explain the Truth Project. Truth is a Native organized, Native-led, community-driven research project that began in the spring of 2020 with the resolutions released by the Minnesota Indian Affairs Council. Truth has a braided methodology that looks into the past, present, and future of university-tribal relations. There are 11 recognized tribal nations with whom Minnesota shares geography, and many more who have been displaced for the benefit of the state. As a land-grant institution that was created through and continues to profit from the genocide, coercion, theft, and forced displacement of Dakota, Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, and Cheyenne peoples, the University of Minnesota has an obligation to recognize and counter the historical and contemporary injustices that continue to shape our environment. The university can begin by acknowledging the ongoing debt that is owed to the region's tribal nations, respecting tribal sovereignty, and striving to build trust through mutually beneficial education, partnerships, research, policies, and practices that center indigeneity. Methods specific to this paper were inductive archival research. I did not really have any plans going into the archives. I didn't know what I was going to find. Really, the one thing that I was looking for was the script receipt from the first piece of land that the university sold to fund the Permanent University Fund, or the PUF Fund. I did not find that. And instead, this sent me on multiple trips to both the MNHS and the University of Minnesota archives over 6 months. But this was just one small part, right, of a 2.5-year-long community-led participatory research project with the 11 tribal nations of Minnesota. Next slide, please. So I wanted to include this quote from Audra Simpson, a Mohawk scholar of anthropology. She offers critiques of what she refers to as liberal political performances of reconciliation and recognition in so-called Canada. And this is what I've been researching for my master's thesis. In this quote, she talks about calling up the past because it is assumed that all people depart from the same history. But what happens when that history has been twisted? So this says that the past does not form a departure for Indigenous peoples in the same way that it does for settlers, because our present collapses their past. It calls up the past as we contort still to make way for everybody else's present and future. And I think about this quote a lot when I'm in the archives, because there it was more apparent than anywhere else, reading in the Regents' own handwriting, the will to what they refer to on multiple occasions as, quote, dealing with the Indian problem. As Simpson goes on to discuss in her lecture on the folly of reconciliation in so-called Canada, we were not meant to still be here, fighting the very institutions they built, not only to keep us out, but in an attempt to wipe us out. So to me, this quote is a reminder of their failure and the power we hold by being in these spaces and refusing to contort or make ourselves smaller to make way for their perception of what should be. Next slide, please. So we heard a little bit about the first Board of Regents, but what I located in the archives, there's actually 3 founding boards of regents. The first under the Territorial University from 1851 to 1860. Then in 1860, the university closed down. And in 1863, an emergency board was appointed by the Minnesota legislature. And they served until 1867 when the university reopened. In 1868, they brought in a new Board of Regents, and that university then opened as the state institution. The university enjoys constitutional autonomy. This is a law that was created by the men who would go on to name themselves as the Board of Regents. And what this means is that the board alone is empowered to manage the university, but also the legislature made a condition that says judicial relief is available if the regents abuse the management powers granted by the state constitution. The legislature may place conditions on university appropriations if the conditions do not violate the university's autonomy. The university is still subject to general lawmaking power so far as it does not impede the regent's ability to manage the university. So what we see here is a very twisted set of rules. On one hand, it says that the state has the ability to kind of rein the regents in, but then there's also that caveat, right? So long as it doesn't interfere with their duties. So what this tells me is that our energy needs to be spent on advocating for legislative change that forces the Board of Regents to cede some of their power. Next slide, please. So this is just a general timeline of events. The university was never separated from actions of land grabs. Rather, the Board of Regents were often the instigators. The university likes to kind of tell a story that it inherited its lands from the federal government through political acts that are separate and distinct from the university. However, we know this to be untrue, and it is time to reclaim the narrative of how the university truly came into existence and that it was methodically planned and executed by the founders of this institution. So when I went first into the archives at MNHS, with the help of Sophie Hunt, who worked on this project initially through Minnesota Transform, and looking for that receipt for that first piece of land. Instead, what we found was a box of what were land claim disputes that went through the land management office. And I started to notice that the names that were signing on behalf of the university were some of the names that we know have problematic history with Indigenous peoples on this land. So Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey, Henry Rice, Pillsbury. So finding these names was a huge step. And I went from MNHS archives to the university archives, and there, with the help of Ellen Holt-Worrell, I was able to look through the Daniel Sprague papers. Mr. Sprague was an accountant and recorder of the experimental station from 1887 to 1890. And Ellen flagged this box because it contained Mr. Sprague's report titled "A History of the University Land Grants." This report was most insightful into the minds of how the first Board of Regents worked. Many major actors in the colonial political sphere appear on the list that I shared on the previous slide. Thus, if one of our goals of this report, and I think it should be, is to show the intent by the university to commit genocide and steal land, that Mr. Sprague's report is a huge step towards that end. His report shows coordination between the members of the Board of Regents, state and federal governments, and industry officials, such as the timber, mining, and railroad industry, to lie, cheat, displace, murder, and steal native lands. It also illuminates the formation of the quasi-governmental body that is the university. The board was the government and the government was the board. And they made sure through a charter that when Minnesota became a state in 1858, that the university was granted that constitutional autonomy, allowing it for self-governance from the state, even though it still gets a lot of funding from the state. So just to go through the timeline quick, 1851 is when the Territorial University first opened. This was the first land grab by the University of Minnesota. And we often think of the Morrill Act as the land grab, but the university had multiple land grabs. In 1857, the Enabling Act was written and Minnesota became a state. And that is when they were able to access the first 46,000 acres of land from the federal government. In 1860, the university closed due to financial mismanagement of the funds that they made off the sale of those lands. An emergency board was appointed by the legislature. Henry Rice was asked at that time to use his influence to allow Minnesota to gain more lands through the Morrill Act. And that was what due to what they considered Minnesota's unique situation of going from a territory to a territorial institution to a state institution. In 1862, the Board of Regents advocated for many anti-Indigenous policies. They have correspondence in their meeting minutes and in their archival records of advocating for the Railroad Act, the Homestead Act, the Morrill Act, and also for the US Dakota War. And in 1868, the university reopened as a state institution. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I just said, the same folks who were responsible for the US Dakota War, which ended in the Dakota genocide and exile, were also the men who created this institution through a series of violence-backed land cessions, treaties, and wars. And that means that every single person at the University of Minnesota is a benefactor of these policies written more than 150 years ago. The Dakota are the original peoples of this land where the Twin Cities campus has settled, and here where we sit today. And as I said earlier, I believe that this was a choice on behalf of the original Board of Regents to locate the university so close to Dakota people's place of creation and other sacred sites, and was just one of several strategic political maneuvers taken by members of the founding Board of Regents that together equate to ethnic cleansing. And nobody, not even Native folks, truly understood the extent of these land grabs and what they meant contemporarily until 2020, when Robert Lee and Tristan Atone published their article in High Country News titled Land Grab Universities. And we still don't have all of the information. Our research is very surface level. We had a small team and there's a lot of materials in the archives. So if this was what we were able to access just in our brief time there, I can only imagine what else lives down in the archives. Again, the university has long claimed to be this benevolent benefactor of land gifted by the federal government. This stance, however, fails to acknowledge the violence, genocide, and dispossession enacted by the university agents through institutional, state, and federal policies. Because of the university's position as a regional and worldly preeminent institution of higher education, that narrative has been accepted by the public at large. However, my research shows that the university was established as a type of shell corporation, one method among many used by these high-ranking colonial politicians to funnel land into the university and out to industry officials as a means of laundering monies made from the dispossession and genocide of Minnesota Makoche's Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. So just to take a step back here and talk about some of the definitions that I am working on. Ethnic cleansing and genocide both come from the United Nations conventions. So ethnic cleansing is not actually considered against the law or against international law. However, a UN commission of experts founded after the Bosnian War came up with this definition, that ethnic cleansing is a purposeful policy designed by one ethnic or religious group to remove by violent and terror-inspiring means the civilian population of another ethnic or religious group from certain geographic areas. Next slide, please. So the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide states that genocide is a law, an international law that the US has signed on to. This is essentially a treaty And it is called a treaty that is also a moral obligation towards humanity. It was created on December 9th of 1948, and the US ratified this in 1988. So Article 2 of this convention states that the following actions equate to genocide: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Persons committing genocide or any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3 shall be punished, whether they are constitutionally responsible rulers, public officials, or private individuals. So I guess the first hard question that I have is why hasn't the Board of Regents been charged with the crime of genocide? Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's been multiple land grabs by the university for a total so far that we have tracked down 186,791 acres. This just includes lands that were given to the university by the federal government. It does not include lands that the University Board of Regents have purchased. Since its founding in 1851, U of M has been the beneficiary of multiple land grabs, which provided the university with nearly 200,000 acres of land through the dispossession of Indigenous nations. In 1851, Regent Henry Sibley successfully lobbied the federal government for land to found the university. Congress authorized the Department of Interior to set apart and reserve from sale out of any of the public lands within the territory of Minnesota to which Indian title has been or may be extinguished and not otherwise appropriated a quantity of land not exceeding 2 entire townships for use and support of a university in said territory. The land that the Regents had scouted, however, and inventoried for resources, and then decided that they wanted, was and remains Dakota land. And just 6 months after this act was written, Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey, and several other founding regents were present at Mendota for the deceptive signing of the 1851 Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. This treaty left the Dakota uncompensated for more than 100,000 acres of land. A decade later, after the Board of Regents had mismanaged the profits they made from the sale of the 46,000 acres they received during this land grab in 1851, the Morrill Act of 1862 presented a rich solution to U of M's financial catastrophe. Passed just 6 months before the Dakota War, in the midst of sustained starvation, rape, murder, and exile of many Dakota, Cheyenne, and Ho-Chunk peoples, authorized by Governor and Regent Alexander Ramsey, and enforced by Brigadier General and Regent Henry Sibley, the Regents were able to use the Morrill Act to obtain and sell Dakota lands to create what Lee and Atone refer to as the Minnesota windfall. The expropriated Dakota lands provided more than 830,000 acres, and this is more land used to fund more universities than any other land grab that contributed to the Morrill Act. From the sale of Dakota lands, as we heard earlier from the Kira Fellows, obtained through the Morrill Act of 1862, the university's return on investment was 25,000%. Not only was that more than any other university, but we can't find a comparable profit anywhere in history. Even if we think of like the .com sell-off and bubble, that only had a profit of 100% return on investment. So This was a large sum, and we weren't sure at first how the Regents were able to make such a profit. And adding to that confusion was the fact that as I was digging through all of their archival records, there appeared to be little division between the state, the business of the state, and the business of the university. However, Danny from the Capstone team made the discovery doing the forensic financial analysis of the university's PUF funds that the university bonded out the profits that they made from the sale of these lands from the PUF fund to every municipality in the state of Minnesota, and basically developed the entire state off of the sale of Indigenous lands. So the way they were able to do this is when we were down in the archives, Ellen gave us a tour, as Adriana mentioned earlier. We came across some small metal boxes. And in these boxes were dozens of small leather-bound field note journals. And it turns out that those were written by a geologist by the name of Winchell. And what he did was essentially develop the geological survey system. And in these ledgers that he created was basically an inventory of every more than human being that lived on that land. And then the Regents would get correspondence from industry officials saying stuff like, okay, I'm looking for a section of land that has tall white pines, close to a stream where we can float them down. And the Regents would flip through these books, find one that matched, and they would write back stuff like, we have this section available with 6,000 feet of lumber. So it was no longer a living tree, even though it was still living on the land. It was already commodified. So again, the founding regents and subsequent boards strategically selected lands based on what resources existed there, and they did so using Winchell's field notes, and they used any means necessary to remove Indigenous peoples from them. They then sold those lands to the highest bidder, often their friends and relatives in the timber, mining, and railroad industries. And we know this because of the correspondence back and forth between these men. And in urban areas, like the areas that surround the university now, the regents were able to sell these lands to individuals who purchased the land through bonds that were also offered by the regents at rates of 7%. So the early regents made their fortunes through a series of trades, basically. And they continue to profit off of these lands. As we mentioned during Jalen's presentation, through the Treaty of 1854 and the expropriation of Anishinaabe King or Ojibwe lands, U of M gained mineral rights from which it still collects mining royalties today. And in 1866, the university displaced the Bois Forte Band when the university's geologists thought they discovered gold on the shores of Lake Vermilion and placed us on a much smaller land base at Nett Lake. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so my research ultimately came to focus on 4 of the regents: Henry Sibley, Alexander Ramsey, Henry Rice, and John Sargent Pillsbury. And I'm just going to take a moment to talk about one, Henry Sibley, because just from what I find in the archives, he seemed to have the most power out of any of the founding regents. So Sibley was a fur trader who became the first congressional delegate for the territory of Minnesota. In this capacity, he introduced a bill that would become the first land grant. And on February 13th, 1851, just 3 days after Congress passed the land grant memorial, the state legislature passed the university's first charter, stating that the institution was to be located at or near the Falls of St. Anthony, which is what they were calling Owamni. And again, this connection to Dakota communities and knowledge is important because it makes those actions by the regents all the more insidious. But this was not the first time that Sibley stole native lands. In 1834, he was appointed the regional manager of the American Fur Company, Sioux outfit, and made his headquarters at Mendota. The AFC departments were sold to partners who included Sibley, and their business strategy became one of reorganization, and they changed from fur trading to treaty making. In 1837, the Dakota and Pine treaties coincided with the collapse of the fur trade. Sibley and other new owners of AFC used their political connections to ensure that treaty monies would first go to fur traders to pay off debts incurred, because AFC had created a debt cycle for the Indigenous people who were coming back with furs. So this was, in effect, a government bailout for the fur trade on the backs of Native people. In 1838, Sibley was appointed the first justice of the peace west of the Mississippi. And 1 year later, in 1839, in a Dakota ceremony, he married a Dakota woman by the name of Tashina Ohindewe, also known as Red Blanket Woman. And she comes from Black Dogs Village. They had a daughter who is often referred to only by her English name of Helen Hastings. However, she was raised by missionaries in a missionary school, because in 1842, Sibley left Red Blanket Woman, and we don't know why or what happened, but she died the following year, and Helen was left without a mother. And instead of raising her, Sibley decided to send her off to a mission school. That same year, AFC went bankrupt amid the dying fur trade. In 1843, Sibley married a woman by the name of Sarah Jane Steele, who is the sister of Franklin Steele, a business associate of his and also one of the founding regents. In 1848, Sibley was elected as the first delegate to US Congress from the Wisconsin Territory, which includes much of present-day Minnesota east of the Mississippi River. He advocated for the creation of a Minnesota Territory from a portion of the Wisconsin Territory and an additional tract west of the Mississippi. In 1849, with the help of Sibley's advocacy in Congress, Minnesota became a territory. And he was then selected to represent what they referred to at the time as mixed blood people, because he had a daughter with a Dakota woman. Because of his connections with Dakota communities in Minnesota, Sibley played important roles in many treaty negotiations. However, we see from the type of negotiations that he was making, he was using the knowledge that he had gleaned from living in Dakota communities to take lands. From 1849 to 53, he served as that territorial delegate to Congress, representing the fur traders' interest in the treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. So at that time, he was representing the university's interests, the fur traders' interests, and this resulted in 24 million acres of land being open to European settlement. He also wrote the statute, as we said earlier, of where the University of Minnesota was to be established. And just for me personally, knowing that he at one point had a Dakota wife, he has a Dakota daughter, he knew the importance of this place to Dakota reproductive systems and Dakota families. And I don't know how we can view that as anything other than an act of genocide. So by 1853, Sibley retired from the fur trade. He liquidated all of his holdings and he began investing in the very lands that he had negotiated in treaties at Traverse de Sioux, Mendota, Hastings, and St. Anthony Falls. In 1857, he helped to write the Enabling Act, which allowed voters to decide whether Minnesota would become a state. And it did. In 1858, Minnesota became a state. And he was elected the first governor of Minnesota State. Just 2 years afterwards, in 1860, and 2 years before the Dakota War, the university was in extreme debt. The total debts owed by the institution totaled more than $120,000 in their monies. And today that would be equivalent to the purchasing power of approximately $4 million. We learned from the Sprague papers that the Regents also agitated the matter of a new land grant, as it then seemed inevitable that the entire grant would be sacrificed to pay off this indebtedness. Because the governor at the time, Alexander Ramsey, who was also a member of the Board of Regents, recommended that the remaining lands that the university had not yet sold be turned over to the university's creditors. And I believe Ramsey did this because most of the university's creditors were the Board of Regents. So they had funded that themselves. And he wanted to make sure that they were getting their money back if the university closed. Finally, in 1864, through the influence of John Sargent Pillsbury, the mill guy, the flour guy, Pillsbury Doughboy, the legislature appointed a new board of 3 regents and made Pillsbury the new chairman. He was then authorized to and empowered to sell the lands, the remaining lands, which totaled 14,000 acres from that first land grab in 1851. And he then processed and arranged, compromised, settled, and paid off all claims and damages that were incurred by the university, because several of their creditors had already taken them to court to try to get these funds back. So a senator at that time, Henry Rice, was requested to, and I quote from the Regents' report to the state legislature in 1862, Henry Rice was requested to use his influences to obtain more lands in addition to those in the Enabling Act, which was the first land grab for the territorial institution. The second, he argued, would be for a state institution. The language used is in the future tense in the Enabling Act, and authorizes the federal government to set apart 72 sections of land that were separate and distinct from the 46,000 that they had originally received in the 1851 land grab. And Senator Rice, who again was also a founding board member, was successful and advocated for the 1862 land grab. The US Congress agreed with him that the law that they wrote stipulated that the first land grab was for a territorial institution, and that Minnesota as a state was now eligible for another land grab. So by now the Regents had learned that they could hoard vast wealth through land dispossession. And if we recall from Leanna Tone's article, they write, if we consider the wider significance of the session of 1851, so that's the Treaty of Traverse de Sioux, and its grim aftermath to the National Land Grant University system, no other Indigenous session provided land to more universities. Nearly 830,000 acres from this treaty, an area more than 3 times the size of Los Angeles, would help fund the endowment of 35 land grant universities. Minnesota Makoche furnished 1 out of every 13 acres redistributed under the Morrill Act. And as we've seen from Kyle's map earlier, that, the universities were all over the country. And Ramsey claimed this as Minnesota's windfall. a mere 5 weeks after the largest mass execution in US history, with the hanging of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862. Next slide, please. So after the High Country News article came out, NISA, or the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association Journal, wrote a series of articles, or published a series of articles, and one of them was written by Randall Akey. And this is a socioeconomic analysis of the impacts and specifically access to housing Indigenous peoples have. Just over 1 mile from here, there's hundreds of houseless relatives camped out in parks along the highway, because as Native people, we experience more homelessness per capita than any other group. This is an intergenerational impact of land theft on Indigenous families. As I mentioned earlier, in 1958, the University of Minnesota Extension facilitated the relocation of Boys Fort Band members once again. 36 families were removed from their homelands and sent to Minneapolis, cut off from resources, family, and their traditional kinship networks. One of the people relocated was my grandma, Irene Weiss. My grandma always wanted to go to college to be a nurse. Instead, she was funneled into a training program where she would never earn a degree. They made her cut her hair, and this has catapulted my family for 3 generations into a cycle of poverty and violence. And this is an echo of the original violence enacted by the founding regents. However, this cycle stops with me. As a first-generation student, I have my kids here with me. They learn right along with me, so they know the histories and the truths that I did not know growing up. And they're actually doing a report on this and taking it back to the kids at their school and teaching kids in their generation about these truths, so we can try to stop these cycles. Okay, next slide, please. So where do we go from here? I believe the University of Minnesota has a moral responsibility to Indigenous peoples. In documentation of meetings, correspondence, and other materials in the university archives, we read information that makes us believe the university has a greater obligation to Indigenous peoples than other land grant institutions because of the actions taken by the Board of Regents when the university closed due to financial mismanagement of the first land grab. This obligation is based on the federal trust responsibility due to the university's founding as a territorial institution. And in one of the reports written by John Sargent Pillsbury, as one of the emergency board members put in place by the Minnesota legislature, the regents accepted full legal indebtedness of the territorial institution. And I believe that that also applies to them inheriting the federal trust responsibility. And broadly speaking, the trust responsibility is a moral obligation that a government entity has to support tribal sovereignty, self-governance, economic prosperity, to protect lands and the rights to use those lands, along with responsibilities to medical, dental, education, housing, and other social services. The University of Minnesota, as a quasi-governmental body and former federal institution, has never upheld this responsibility, despite inheriting all the lands and financial resources associated with the territorial institution. Instead, the university has done everything to acquire more lands, more of our knowledge, ancestors, and artifacts to feed its insatiable need to accumulate wealth at the expense of Indigenous peoples. This trust responsibility is constructed by treaties, statutes, and precedents set by prior conduct. It transcends specific treaty promises and imposes a duty to promote tribal sovereignty and economic self-sufficiency. This means that at the bare minimum, the University of Minnesota has an obligation to consult and partner with tribal governments to ensure tribal sovereignty and the trust are upheld. Rather than meet its moral obligations, the founding regents and subsequent boards have made themselves and the university perpetually wealthy through the expropriation of Indigenous lands. Next slide, please. So in more recent times, violent acts by the University of Minnesota against Indigenous peoples have continued. As we heard from Adriana, medical research on young children of the Red Lake Nation happened in the 1960s for a disease that was easily treated with penicillin. We also found in the archives reports on, and I quote, the abnormally high birth rate of Indian babies, written by the University Extension in the 1970s. As we know, this was around the time that Indigenous women and many women of color were subject to forced sterilization. We have not uncovered any proof that the University of Minnesota committed any of these procedures. However, the fact alone that they were contributing to this intellectual conversation is highly disturbing. Relocation programs were also managed by the Extension throughout the 20th century. They removed Indigenous peoples from their lands into urban settings without access to resources, housing, community, and kinship networks that had sustained our tribes for generations. The theft of ancestral remains, sacred items, knowledge, and culture continues to this day, excuse me. The silencing of this true history for a whitewashed version of land-grant universities has also been perpetrated by the University of Minnesota. And finally, the invisibility of Indigenous students, staff, faculty, narratives, history, culture, land, along with the undervaluation of oral stories, epistemologies, ontologies, methodologies, and community knowledge systems has also and continues to harm Indigenous peoples. And we could go on. The university has a lot of work to do, beginning with an honest accounting of its past, present, and commitment to making lasting systemic changes towards a better future. Next slide, please. I did an international comparison, as I mentioned earlier, of the Kansas countries, particularly focusing on New Zealand and Canada. And New Zealand in particular offers models that the University of Minnesota could follow, such as intergenerational learning centers where community members are welcome to teach, with the understanding that this data is not being collected for the use of the university. Most of my findings on that actually mirror what Jalen presented. And I think that it's important that even when we're looking towards international models, that we're centering tribal specific actions for each of the 11 nations that we share geography with. Next slide, please. So today the university continues to root itself in the violent epistemical hierarchy of Western knowledge, especially when it comes to who gets to access, learn, know, write about, and hold knowledge. Throughout this project, we have had to code switch, or in essence, balance multiple different modes of knowing to protect ourselves while striving to center Indigenous epistemologies, cognizant of how academia undervalues this type of knowledge. These Indigenous knowledge systems that we speak of have been passed down from generation to generation. And as a couple of folks have alluded to, there are stories that are only shared at specific times that contain guiding principles that the Indigenous peoples are intended to protect. However, throughout time, this knowledge has been extracted by colonial institutions, Our protocols are not honored, and we often do not get the recognition that we deserve for what we have and continue to contribute to society. So over and over again, I heard a theme from the fellows' presentations that tribes themselves are investing in the reclamation and revitalization of their traditional lifeways. But any criminal has to pay restitution. So why isn't the university footing the bill for these programs and these initiatives? In addition, I believe many people in the university still view tribal communities as poor, uneducated, and incapable of handling our daily affairs, let alone research. But our nations are and always have been strong, wealthy, and fully capable. The epistemologies or Western epistemologies, I believe, just lack the ability to understand that. So for example, the university continues to maintain ties to research that is in direct conflict with the sovereignty of tribal nations, and it has no formal research protocol or policies for working with Indigenous communities. Karen has come on and is working with Vice President of Research to begin to formulate some of those. However, at this moment, there is no guarantee that when research is being conducted in community, that tribes maintain data sovereignty. And data sovereignty is the right tribal nations have to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. It derives from the tribe's inherent right to govern their peoples, lands, and resources. And those are policy briefs that were set out by the Native Nations Institute. MIAC and the tribal nations made contracts specifically to protect the data sovereignty in this project. The University of Minnesota has taken enough from tribal nations, and we were very intentional in the design of this project to ensure that this was not university data. However, at times it felt as though our time and energy was being spent asserting data sovereignty rights of the tribes, and protecting the tribal research fellows' knowledge. Excuse me. So on multiple occasions and from multiple directions, we were forced to fight to uphold the very contracts, legally binding documents that stipulated the relationship between MIAC, the tribes, and the university in this project. There is nothing in these contracts that would require a tribal research fellow to work with the university, to share data with the university, or to work with the university or its external partners in any way, or in any other way make known to the university the scope and contents of its research. Of particular importance in these contracts are 2 points. One says that as appropriate, the grantee or the tribe will make materials available to a joint task force. The task force consists of the core university team here, the tribal research fellows, and the task force members, the faculty task force members. And I think it's important to say as appropriate, right? Because then it's up to the tribes to determine what is appropriate and what is not. So we're honoring their sovereignty through that. The second section that's related to data sovereignty grants full intellectual property to the tribe. This is the data sovereignty piece I've referenced. We knew the university would want to extract the knowledge and data. It's what they do. However, this protects the tribes and more specifically the tribal research fellows. So what we need is actionable and measurable systems change. The university has vast repositories of knowledge from many different tribal communities across Turtle Island, not just those who had homelands in Minnesota Makoche. We sifted through but a fraction of this information. And through the university libraries, we have worked to open access, as I mentioned earlier, to these databases. This is our history and our knowledge. The university has generated an exceptional amount of wealth off of traditional Indigenous knowledges while simultaneously denying us access to them. This is at the heart of the data sovereignty discussion. And these are just two small steps that can be taken by any researcher at the University of Minnesota in their research process to mitigate harm caused when working in community. Because there are often power imbalances that exist between institutional researchers and community members that result in us not being able to ask our own questions, seek our own answers, tell our own narratives, and there is often misalignment between community needs, researcher agenda, and institutional image. Institutional research policies have oftentimes not respected tribal sovereignty or even considered data sovereignty. And because of this, we have had to dedicate more time to making these processes. So rather than going to an internal review board or an institutional review board, why aren't university researchers like those at the University of Oregon going to tribes to get permission to do the research and working together with the community members to design ways to collect, analyze, access, and store data that they collect, which honors and upholds data sovereignty at all points in a research project. As the region's preeminent, as one of the region's preeminent research facilities and renowned worldwide, the University of Minnesota can begin to support Indigenous-led research through public support and allocation of funding for Indigenous communities to make research and innovation pathways more stable and abundant for Indigenous people. Temporal and spatial resources and networks can be reallocated to better support the reclamation and restoration of Indigenous epistemologies, perspectives, and language revitalization. It also means we must continue to push to decolonize educational settings by incorporating Indigenous curriculum, history, and worldviews across all departments. And this means that the university would take a completely different approach to research than what we are used to. This institution, its community members would accept that not all knowledge is for them, though they can still facilitate the learning for Indigenous folks in other ways. This would mean also that the U of M finally stops trying to expropriate our lands, knowledges, and cultures. Yeah, so I think I'll end there. I think that the last thing that I'll say about this slide, this is my final slide, is I think everybody expects us to have answers, but we've barely scratched the surface. So instead of answers, I want to leave you with this slide of questions that I pose to the entire university community. And these questions include, what moral obligations does the university have to Indigenous people? How does the university meet these obligations? When is the University of Minnesota going to use the wealth it continues to generate from the genocide of Indigenous people to stop these violations of human rights? When will the university shift institutional paradigms to uplift Indigenous peoples? And one question that has been on my mind since the beginning of this project is, when an entire institution is built on stolen wealth, land dispossession, and genocide, can it reflect and change deeply enough to truly serve as a site of healing? And how do we get to that point when we have yet to come to a place of shared truth? Miigwech.